Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, Chinese Handcuffs, How Clean, Plentiful U.S. Energy Can Create the Next American Century. Please welcome Victoria Coates, Vice President of the Heritage Foundation's Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy.
Good morning, everyone. This is a very exciting day for the Davis Institute, the completion of our Chinese Handcuffs project. And it's also my first event here in Van Andel, so getting to use this wonderful new space that we have here at Heritage is, as I said, a red letter day for us. So I am Victoria Coates, the Vice President of the Davis Institute of National Security and Foreign Policy here at the Heritage Foundation. And it's a pleasure to open today's exciting event, Chinese Handcuffs, How Clean, Plentiful U.S. Energy Can Create the Next American Century. This has been a year-long project for us here in Davis, with 4 chapters, or pillars rather. Today is our final one. And Chinese Handcuffs, which we have many examples of, so you can get one and play with it if you would like, is a metaphor for China's decade-long project to subvert American energy dominance and replace that with reliance on Chinese products for the so-called Green Revolution. And it represents the U.S. environmental agenda, which dates back to the 1970s, but has accelerated significantly under the Biden administration. Over the last decade, as America emerged as one of the world's 3 great energy producers, the People's Republic of China has executed a plan to reverse roles by infiltrating and dominating the green movement embraced by many on the political left. Combined, this movement has come at the cost of natural U.S. energy advantages and energy consumers. Throughout 2024, we've published 3 reports that explain in detail the Chinese Handcuffs dilemma. In the Pillar 1 report, Aaron Walsh and Andrew Harding detail how China has been executing a long-term plan to turn its energy vulnerabilities into advantages over the United States. In the Pillar 2 report, Brent Sadler warns of how America's energy network has vulnerabilities that China could exploit during a conflict. And of course, a kinetic war is one of the most energy-intensive things you can do. So it would be a huge problem if we abdicated that strength. In the Pillar 3 report, Diana Furtgott-Roth and Miles Pollard offer data-driven assessments on how China is dominating the world's green energy supply chains and forcing the United States to increase its dependencies on Chinese resources. Our research has painted a concerning and ever-growing dangerous picture of Chinese energy dominance over the American people. Today, I am proud to launch our 4th and final Chinese Handcuffs report, titled Extricating America from Chinese Handcuffs. So this is more of a good news story than the previous ones. Diana Furtgott-Roth and Andrew Hale present the policy recommendations to help keep America free itself from China's energy grasp. To keynote our capstone event, it is my great honor to introduce Alaska's Governor Mike Dunleavy. Governor Dunleavy was first elected governor in 2018 and then again in 2022, making him the first Republican governor in Alaska to win re-election since 1978. During his time in office, Governor Dunleavy has had numerous encounters with China. Most recently, when Chinese and Russian aircraft incurred into U.S. airspace, he rightly noted that, quote, Alaska's strategic position on the globe gives the United States an advantage in the Arctic and the Pan-Pacific, but we need leaders in Washington to recognize that Russia and China are increasing their military presence in the region. Today, Governor Dunleavy will speak about the importance of American energy and the threats posed by the Chinese Communist Party. Following Governor Dunleavy's remarks, Diana Furtgott-Roth will join us for a moderated conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy to the stage.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here today. And I think there's a handout or two. We only have about 20 of those handouts, and I think they're important for folks to take a look at if they're at your table. If not, you should try and grab a copy. But one is a handout that Senator Dan Sullivan actually put together on Alaska. And what it does, it kind of strikes at the heart of the introduction. What it does is it talks about the 66 actions against the state of Alaska by our own federal government. It's 66 executive actions since the Biden administration came into being that is really handcuffing our ability to be part of the solution to America's problems, and that is making sure that we produce everything we can here in this country, not just for the jobs, the wealth, and the revenue, and not just to protect the environment, we'll talk about that briefly, but also national security reasons, because we have the solutions here in this country. But it'll outline what is happening to Alaska. When you take a look at this, you think of this in the context of, well, this almost appears to be something that we would have to do to one of our adversaries. Our adversaries actually have less sanctions against them than we do. So as we are working on ensuring that we're able to produce oil, gas, minerals, timber, et cetera, our own federal government is working against us to do that, but they're working with our adversaries, whether it's Iran, whether it's Venezuela, other countries, to ensure that they are able to produce the materials that we need. It doesn't make sense from a national strategic perspective. There's also another, there'll be another handout. It's just a plain handout that talks about the different resources that Alaska has. And as you know, Alaska has tremendous resources. So I'm going to go back and forth between talking a little bit about the state itself and some of the national security issues that we see in Alaska and some of our resources that we could actually deploy to help the rest of this country. So I'm going to give you a Chamber of Commerce overview very quickly of Alaska because I think it's important. So Alaska is our largest state. It's 2.5 times the size of Texas. If you put Alaska on a map, Southeast Alaska would touch Georgia and Florida and almost the Atlantic Ocean. The northern part of Alaska would touch the Canadian border by Minnesota, and the Aleutians would be out in the Pacific. We used to have 4 time zones before 1981. That's how large we are. We have 2 time zones today. We've condensed it. We are the furthest northern state, the furthest western state by far, and the furthest eastern state, if you can figure that out. So the furthest eastern state comes because part of our Aleutian Islands presses over the international date line. As a matter of fact, I was a teacher, principal, and superintendent. I was a teacher in a small Eskimo village, and in our school district, there was a little village called Little Diomede, which had Inupiaq Eskimo folks on that island. 2.5 miles across the international date line was Big Diomede, and that was Russia. That's how close we are to our adversaries. So we're the northernmost state, so we're obviously America's Arctic state. We're the westernmost state. We are further west than any other state, including Hawaii. We're 1,300 miles from Japan, and we're 1,000 miles closer to Australia than California. So you have to have this perspective to see the neighborhood that we live in. We live in a very dangerous neighborhood. The Bering Strait, the Bering Sea, and the Arctic Ocean, especially the Arctic Ocean, is warming up, as we know. And we're getting more and more transshipment. That transshipment is coming from Europe, but it's also coming from Asia. And part of what we want to talk about today is the fact that Alaska is America's fort, but we need a little bit more help by the federal government. So Alaska's military assets are pretty robust. When it comes to our Air Force, we have 2 Air Force bases. We have F-35s, F-22s. If you've been reading the papers recently, you've seen that they've scrambled frequently when the Russians and their Chinese friends are flying into what they call the identification zone. That's between Russian airspace, true American airspace, but it's a zone that they're supposed to identify themselves as they get closer to American airspace. And they're doing this to test our resolve. They're doing this to send a message that although they may be struggling in this war with Ukraine, that they still are out there and they still have robust assets that could be a problem for the United States of America. We also have other adversaries in the Pacific, as we know, the North Koreans. The North Koreans have been testing missiles here for some time. At our Delta Greely Fort Delta Greely, we have missile intercepts. It's a kinetic intercept that would intercept a Korean missile, North Korean missile in space and destroy it. And when I was a state senator for that area, there were several times when I was in that small town that the sirens would go off when the North Koreans were actually launching missiles. The sirens would go off because we didn't know if those missiles were test missiles or actually coming towards Alaska. We are within the missile umbrella of the North Koreans as well. And then, of course, we have the Chinese. Now, the Chinese have declared themselves a near-Arctic nation. They're not anywhere near the Arctic, but they declare themselves a near-Arctic nation. As a result, they've had ships plying the Bering Sea, going into the Arctic Ocean, working with the Russians as well. The Chinese have 4 modern icebreakers. The Russians have at least 46 modern icebreakers. Currently in Alaska right now, we have no icebreakers. There's 2 icebreakers assigned to Alaska. They're very old. They spend most of their time in Seattle being fixed, or one of them being deployed to Antarctica. So you have to imagine for a moment, you have the Arctic state, the only Arctic state that we have in the United States of America, and we have no real functional icebreakers. This is a problem. As mentioned, we have robust assets when it comes to the Air Force. We have robust assets when it comes to the missile defense. And we have a robust Coast Guard presence, largest in the country, and a large Army presence. But we don't have a surface naval presence in the state of Alaska as we currently speak. And I would hope that there are discussions occurring behind closed doors to address that issue as quickly as possible. Now, for some folks that may think, well, okay, Alaska, far away, yes, it's part of the United States, but surely nobody would think about doing anything, to attack Alaska or somehow compromise Alaska. You only have to go back about 70-some years because Alaska was invaded by the Japanese in World War II. We were the only state that was invaded and held, and that was part of the Battle of Midway. A task force went north to, some say, to divert the Americans, but Kiska and Attu, Aleutian Islands in Alaska, they were held by the Japanese for some time and had to be dislodged through a joint Canadian-American force. Alaska was also used as the Lend-Lease, part of the Lend-Lease project that brought airplanes to the Russians through the back doors. This is how the Russians got their airplanes to fight Nazi Germany, was through Alaska, then through Siberia. And many of those airports that were built at the time still exist today and are still functional. And there are parts of Alaska, even today, that are littered with some of the aircraft from World War II that we were sending over to the Russians, as well as a result of the battles that we had in the Aleutians. So Alaska is the true fort for the United States of America. You have forts in many states in this country. Many of those forts are staging areas. Many of those forts are for economic purposes. And in no way am I insinuating that those forts are not important. They are. But in terms of a state on the front edge, the leading edge, the tip of the spear, as they say, there's no state like Alaska. As mentioned, we are further west than any other state, including Hawaii, much closer to Asia than Hawaii is, much closer to Australia, as we mentioned, than California is. So we're not just an Arctic nation. We're a Northern Pacific sovereign, an Arctic state, I should say. We're a Northern Pacific sovereign, and we're a Western Pacific sovereign. We are America's presence in that part of the world. Another detail about Alaska, we have the second busiest air cargo airport in the United States at Ted Stevens International Airport, and it's the 3rd busiest cargo airport in the entire world. You wouldn't think about that in Alaska. But if you think where we're located on the globe, we are 9 hours by plane to any industrialized place in the Northern Hemisphere. That's where our situation is. As a matter of fact, General Billy Mitchell, if you read your history, he was an Army general before the Air Force. He was a proponent of air power, and he was actually court-martialed because he believed that air power could actually be a much more potent and superior a method to sink ships than naval ships sinking each other. He said that who controls Alaska controls the world because of where we're located. Alaska also has its own private rocket launch. We launch satellites into space in Alaska. The University of Alaska was the first university in the world to launch rockets starting in 1965 as well. And they do that to study the aurora. So there's a lot of superlatives regarding Alaska in terms of geography, in terms of location, in terms of our military history, in terms of our military presence today, and also just the location. So strategically, there is no state like Alaska in the entire country. And if you've been reading the papers, watching the news, we've had Russian incursions pretty close to our airspace, as was mentioned, almost daily now. The Japanese, for example, had Russians actually enter their airspace here just a couple days ago. The Japanese had to warn them off by dropping flares. So the activity is picking up in the Arctic. The activity is picking up in the Western Pacific and the Northern Pacific. And again, Alaska is on the forefront. I want to talk a little bit about, and again, if you are able to see this paper that talks about all of the natural resources that Alaska has. Alaska was purchased in 1867. Does anyone know from whom? From the Russians. We were a Russian possession for some time, Alaska was. We were purchased in 1867 from the Russians for $7.2 million. It was a great deal, I have to admit. It was a very good deal. But even to this day, you'll see reports coming out of Russia that they regret that decision. You have some lawmakers in the Duma in Russia that talk about wistfully maybe someday taking Alaska back. So this is fresh in their minds. Alaska's presence is fresh in our Asian allies' minds as well as our adversaries in the Pacific. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the resources that Alaska has. Alaska has 1/7 of the country's timber within Alaska. Alaska has 3 times the fresh water of any other state in the country in Alaska. Alaska has more coastline than the rest of the lower 48, as we call it, the United States, put together. We have more coastline than the rest of the country put together. Alaska has a supergiant on the North Slope called Prudhoe Bay. They came online in the 1960s and early 70s, mid-70s, along the same time as the North Sea did. And this was a result of some of the oil shocks that we were experiencing with the Arab oil embargo. So Alaska, when it comes to oil, was producing at one time in 1990, 2 million barrels of oil per day, dwarfed Texas at that time. Texas has since overtaken Alaska through the fracking process, which has turned America into an energy exporter, a net exporter, which I think we're all grateful for, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, Alaska's oil reserves are tremendous. We've pumped about 16 billion barrels of oil out of Prudhoe Bay. We were only supposed to be able to pump 9. We estimate that there's about 16 billion barrels more on the North Slope to be pumped out. And this includes Anwar and other associated areas on our North Slope. Alaska has 100 trillion cubic feet of gas that we know of. We estimate there's 200 trillion cubic feet of gas in Alaska. And Alaska has 49 of the world's 50 rare earths in Alaska. I have 3 daughters. They all work at one of the largest lead zinc mines in the world in Alaska. One's an engineer, one's a logistics officer, one's a buyer. We have incredible graphite finds. We probably have the largest graphite find right now north of Nome, Alaska, in North America. We, at the Pebble Mine prospect, one of the largest copper, and if we're talking about the Green New Deal or the Green Revolution, we have more copper than almost any other place on the planet that has yet to be developed. We have tremendous gold finds, tremendous silver finds. We have uranium in Alaska. We have an element called antimony, or antimony, if anyone knows what that is. The Chinese, just about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, put some curbs on the export of that rare earth to the rest of the world. We have it in Alaska. The list goes on and on. One of the concerns that we have, I'll go back to our strategic location. One of the concerns that we have, again, is that as our adversaries are building up in the Arctic, in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, America's woefully behind. We mentioned the Coast Guard cutters. The Russians, again, have about 46 icebreakers, not Coast Guard cutters, icebreakers. The Russians have reactivated a lot of old Cold War bases in the Arctic. Even though their population is shrinking, they're starting to, once again, arm up in the Arctic. And they and the Chinese are partnering. And I don't know what the discussions have been here in the Institute, but there are many who believe that as a result of the reordering of globalism in the world, it's evolving back into what we refer to as regionalism, that the Chinese and the Russians, for example, are partnering very closely. There's talk that the Russians will, as a result of their need for hard cash, become more and more of a client state of the Chinese. But both countries are eyeing the Arctic for the mineral resources that are present in the Arctic. And if we don't think that the Chinese are going to do anything in the Arctic, they already are. The Chinese are in Greenland as we speak. They've invested in mines in Greenland. They've invested in ports and airports in Greenland. And they appear to be focused on continuing to do that. That's a problem for the United States. That's a problem for North America. That's a problem for our strategic location as the Arctic warms and the Northwest Passage sees more shipping over the next several decades. And this is an issue that I think needs to be discussed more openly. I think it's an issue that needs to be discussed not just in our think tanks, but hopefully it's being discussed in this administration that currently is in office today. I know under the previous administration, the issue of Greenland had come up because there were already signs that this investment was picking up speed with the Chinese in Greenland. And as I mentioned today, that investment is pretty robust. And unless those discussions continue with the Danes and the Greenlanders, in the hopes of getting a North America-centric strategic approach to the Arctic, there could be some difficulties here on the horizon. And so with our Canadian allies, we have a joint Canadian post in Alaska. Our Canadian allies in America have worked very closely together in the Arctic for decades, many, many decades. Our Canadian friends were part, as I mentioned, of displacing the Japanese from Alaska during World War II. And we do joint flyovers of both of our countries together with NORAD as part of the NORAD entity. And so Alaska's, I'm going to sum it up here, but Alaska's position on the globe is unlike any other. In Alaska as a state, as a fort, as a strategic location for the United States is unlike any other state. Our minerals, our rare earths, our timber, our other metals, we have in Alaska in abundance to be able to solve many of America's issues. We don't need to be dependent on foreign nations. We don't need to be processing and smeltering our elements and our metals in foreign countries. And we need to stop offshoring our national security to other countries in the hopes that somehow this turns adversaries, stated adversaries in action, that somehow it turns them into friends of our great country. And we've put ourselves in a position that I think we all recognize now. Hopefully policymakers are going to do what it takes to turn the tide on what many of us believe in Alaska, and I think many believe that are studying foreign policy and studying the strategic situation that the United States is in, that hopefully this is changed here, if not in this administration, in the next administration that may be coming here on November 5th. So with that, I just want to wrap it up by saying, if you have not been to Alaska, come to Alaska. But when you go to Alaska, you are going to be going not just to a beautiful state, but you're going to be going to a place that was purchased in 1867 for its purpose as a strategic location on the globe, but also for its mineral storehouse, its mineral wealth. And if we can get this administration and future administrations to recognize that Alaska is a solution to a lot of America's problems, it's going to put us in a better strategic location, better national security location. It'll increase our jobs here in America, and it'll be the solution to a lot of our energy problems as well. And so with that, I want to thank you for the time and appreciate being here.
Well, thank you, Governor, for those remarks and for the reminder that many of our solutions to what ails us in the United States are right here at home. And I think for all of us, it's deeply frustrating to hear, the concerns across America from all of our citizens about vulnerabilities, supply chain vulnerabilities, resource vulnerabilities, and to realize that this is utterly unnecessary, that we can and should be supplying ourselves, and not only ourselves, but also partners and allies. One of the frustrations for me as a Pennsylvanian is we're the #2 natural gas producer right now. We could double production with very minor infrastructure investments. and virtually no environmental impact. And you think about what those exports could then mean for the United States. I think of it as our answer to Belt and Road, that nice, clean American natural gas can fuel developing nations with a robust, dense baseload power. So different from what China offers, which is far more predatory and exploitative. So it is an honor for us to welcome my colleague at Heritage, the director of the Energy and Climate Group, Diana Furchtgott-Roth, to the stage. Diana is an economist and brings an extraordinary data-driven analytic approach to our scholarship. And so this year has been a really wonderful partnership between Davis and the Energy and Climate Group as we've mounted this sort of all of Heritage effort. So Governor Dunleavy, along those lines, if I could start with you, at Heritage, we strongly believe in the power of healthy alliances and the value that they provide to American security and prosperity. Could you share how Alaska is working with Indo-Pacific allies and partners to bolster American energy production and commercial activities?
Yeah, it's a great question. So Alaska actually pioneered LNG export to the world in 1968. Out of our Cook Inlet oil and gas fields, we sent liquefied natural gas to the Japanese starting in 1968. That went on for 50 years until that gas field was blown down and lost production. But for 50 years, we helped our Asian ally, Japan, during the Cold War and post-Cold War through exports of natural gas. As mentioned, we currently have 100 trillion cubic feet of natural gas on the North Slope, estimated potentially 200 trillion cubic feet potentially up there on the North Slope. And we are in the process, we have a permitted gas line, a large gas line that would rival the size and scope of the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline. We know what our gas reserves are. We are working constantly with our Asian allies, and the hope is that within the next several months, we're able to eke a deal to be able to continue to export or start up export again to our Asian allies, Japan, Korea, potentially Taiwan, even the Philippines, and maybe Vietnam as well. And so our proximity, once again, to those countries is advantage for the United States and for Alaska. We are actually closer in terms of shipping natural gas to Japan than Australia is. And so that's also through uncontested waters. Oftentimes, shipments coming from Australia, coming from Indonesia, the Indo-Pacific has to go through contested waters, whether it's the Malacca Straits or other pinch points. But in Alaska, it's a clear shot from Alaska across the Pacific to our Asian allies. That's one. We are also working with the Japanese and our Korean allies on more mineral exploration. They're also very interested in carbon sequestration in Alaska. We're not sure where that's going to go, but we have the ability to sequester over 50 gigatons of carbon in Cook Inlet and about 150 gigatons of carbon on the slope as well. And we've had a long relationship with the Japanese up until the Clinton administration with regard to our timber. We would export timber to the Japanese too, but during the Clinton administration, they basically shut down timber operations in Alaska. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, Alaska has 1/7 of the country's timber, but because of those actions decades ago, we have a smaller timber industry right now than Rhode Island. And 400 Rhode Islands could fit in Alaska.
Well, thank you for that. And the other ally that I would bring into that conversation is Taiwan, which is thinking very seriously about its energy security, given the obvious threat from China right across the strait. And they are one of the countries that is impacted by Biden's export license ban because we don't have a free trade agreement with Taiwan. So they actually do fall under that. So in the event of a conflict, we would be severely constricted in what we could surge to Taiwan under the current circumstances. And along those lines, Diana, if I can turn to you to discuss Pillar 4, congratulations on the publication. It's very exciting. To talk about some of the solutions to the Chinese handcuff predicament. Can you give us an overview of some of what you think are the most important policy recommendations in the paper?
Sure, yes, absolutely. Well, politics is full of surprises. No one knew that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. No one knew that Iran-backed Hamas was going to invade Israel. But energy should not be a surprise. In the world full of surprises, energy resilience should be a constant. And that's why a self-manufactured crisis, such as the United States cutting back on its own energy production and putting in place mandates to import components, renewables, vehicles from one of our adversaries, that should be a really amazing thing. And this should not be happening. So the Pillar 4 paper has recommendations to roll this back. We should be producing our own resources from Alaska, from elsewhere in the United States. We should be rolling back the mandates that require us to use the wind turbines, the solar panels, the electric vehicles, to rely on the electric batteries, because China makes all of these. It dominates the world in all of these. And why we are mandating these, this equipment that's being produced by China, to me, is a mystery. And people say, is it incompetence or is it malice? Well, I have no idea. But in our paper, there is a table, and the table is blown up over there in the back of the room for any of you that want to see it, of the 10 most expensive states for electricity and the 10 least expensive. And the 10 most expensive, in general, with a couple of exceptions, rely on these renewable portfolio standards, require that a certain share of electricity be made with renewables. And the 10 least expensive states, with a few exceptions, with maybe one exception, do not do that. So the basic answer in this paper is that we should use our own resources and stop requiring equipment from a country that is not friendly to us. And it's so obvious, Victoria, that I wasn't quite sure why we have to write a paper about it. I mean, it's just common sense.
No, we pride ourselves on common sense here at the Heritage Foundation, and that is an excellent segue to the next topic I want to drill into, no pun intended, which is the sabotage. And this is actually to you first, Governor, and then to you, Diana. I'd like both of your perspectives. The deliberate sabotage of U.S. natural resources under the Biden administration. Some of this did take place under the Obama administration, but what we've seen over the last 4 years really dwarfs that. And it has been a campaign. And you may have heard we're going to have an election in 6 weeks. It's in the news sometimes. And our role here is not to get involved in politics, but to point out policy differences. So I would like to hear more about the 66 actions, which the governor pointed out to me is more than what the administration has done to the Iranians. So that's a pretty serious campaign there. It's their version of maximum pressure, but it's against a U.S. state. If you could delve into that a little bit for us and give us some examples of how that's working.
Sure, I will. But I wanted to just touch on something that was just mentioned, and I think it's the most critical question there is. Is what is occurring because of incompetence or malice? And that is really a very, very, very important question. And we ask ourselves this all the time in Alaska, and here's why. So when we're told that we need to shut down Alaska, whether it's mining, whether it's oil, whether it's gas, because it's for the environment. When I ask some of the environmentalists, well, what happens when you have to get oil and gas from other places in the country? What are their environmental protections like? What are their protections for their minorities like Uyghurs in China? Do they have child labor protection laws? What are they doing to curb their carbon footprint? They don't want to have those discussions. So it's a very good question. And I think it's a question that needs to be hit home and drilled constantly when you're having discussions with folks on the other side of this issue. Why are we doing this? Usually when this happens, when you do a rush to renewables or you change something dramatically, it's a social engineering process, we know that. But usually when that happens, it's because you've run out of oil, or you've run out of coal, or you've run out of other methods and means by which you can power a civilization. But those discussions are, they're difficult to have. They don't want to have those discussions at all. But it's a very good question. Is it through incompetence? Sometimes I think you cannot be that incompetent. Or is it through malice? And that's a potential that I think we all are probably a little concerned to want to confront. But nonetheless, the results are that we've offshored our national security, we've offshored jobs, we've offshored opportunity, which is huge, and you're not protecting the environment when you send these things overseas. It just doesn't happen. There was an old story, and I'll kind of wrap up. There was an old story that when we were building the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, that some engineers had come over from another large country to the west of us and said, how much oil do you put in the pipeline? And our engineers explained, and they'd say, how much oil comes out at the end? And our engineers were confused. And that was because in that large country to the west of us, there would be oil that would be leaking out of that pipeline through its entire length. But in Alaska, we don't even flare our gas. We don't even have a drop of oil that we allow to drop from a truck on the North Slope without having an absorbent diaper underneath it. So long story short, and the best way to answer it, I guess, is we are being sabotaged. Alaska is being used by many NGOs and many organizations and this federal administration that we currently have now as a poster child for how you can shut something down under the preposition or the position that you're going to protect this state. But at the same time, when you do that, you ruin a whole bunch of opportunities. And one last thing, because of oil production on the North Slope, where our Inupiaq Eskimo friends live, our fellow Alaskans, and my wife happens to be Eskimo, my kids work at a mine, as I mentioned, the life expectancy of those people has increased by 14 years since oil started flowing in the North Slope. Well, how could that be? Because now you're able to afford clinics, airports, schools, all of the modern amenities that we all enjoy, our folks on the North Slope now enjoy in the Arctic. And it's only because of oil. But no other place on the planet that we can find in terms of research has had that much of an increase in life expectancy than our folks on the North Slope.
And Diana, if you could drill into a little bit some of the, well, actually, Governor, I did want to say, I think we might have to embrace the and here with the malice and the incompetence, that it could be kind of a devil's brew of the two.
Would be.
But for you, Diana, a very similar question. You know, what sorts of sabotage have you seen done to American energy security over the last 4 years of the Biden-Harris administration?
You can just look at President Biden's executive order on day one, and you can just start with that and think, well, what if we just rolled that back? I mean, he ended the Keystone XL pipeline. He forbade offshore drilling. He ended a lot of leases on federal lands. This was just by executive order. So all we have to do is have the next president, whether it's a President Trump or President Harris, she's in favor of fracking, she said, just roll that back and then allow companies to make the best use of these resources. And at the same time, we want to be ending the mandates. So President Biden had a whole slew of executive orders, for example, that required 72%, about 70% of all new cars sold to be electric by 2032. This isn't something we need. At the same time, he had another executive order that would result in most coal-fired power plants and many natural gas-fired power plants closing down in 2040. So you have a perfect storm. He's sowing a legacy of future problems by at the same time requiring electric vehicles and then also having these power plants closed down. I mean, this is so nonsensical. I cannot imagine why anyone would do it. And this is the same agency, the Environmental Protection Agency. So one would think if an agency is putting out two rules, perhaps in one they would mention the other. So in the electric vehicle rule, they would say, well, by the way, these power plants are going to be closing down. And in the power plant rule, they would say, well, by the way, you're going to be forced to buy electric vehicles at the same time. But no, the one rule doesn't mention the other. And by the way, there's a third rule on particulates, which requires states to reduce their particulates. And it doesn't even mention that electric vehicles produce 26% more particulates than gasoline-powered vehicles because they are heavier. So we have plenty of resources of oil. We have plenty of gasoline. And Americans are, by the way, flocking to buy non-plug-in hybrid vehicles that have a smaller battery and then get better gas mileage because the battery is charged with the operation of the engine and the operation of the braking system. So Americans love technology. They love a good deal. But in areas such as Alaska, Wyoming, North Dakota, where batteries lose a lot of power in the cold, where you don't have charging stations, where you have to go often, hundreds of miles in a day, just to do your job, these electric vehicles are not selling, and it makes no sense to mandate them. So if I were in the next administration, I would roll back the President Biden day one executive orders, and I would get rid of all these different mandates. You know, here at Heritage, we're pro-choice. We think you should be able to buy a gasoline-powered vehicle, an electric vehicle, a natural gas stove, an electric stove, an electric water heater, a natural gas-fired water heater. But the other side wants to tell us all what to do, and that should be ended.
Well, what would be interesting, I mean, roll back the executive orders, absolutely, and again, we passed out a paper, but follow the law. In 2017, when the bill was passed that opened up ANWR for leases under President Trump and Congress at that time, lease sales went up, but those lease sales were taken away by this administration. A clear violation of the law. Here's something interesting to keep an eye on. That law also mandated this administration to put up for bid ANWR leases, a second ANWR lease, by December of this year. So we're 30-some days out from the election. Many of us don't think that lease sale will even go on the books and even happen. Another clear violation of the law. So absolutely roll back the executive sessions, but next administration just needs to follow the law when it comes to places like Alaska and the ANWR leases.
I think that's a critical point, and it's one I've had many discussions with private industry about, that the only thing worse than a bad policy is not knowing what the policy is. And the kind of uncertainty that these executive orders and flouting of existing laws have created is part of the chilling effect that the far left is counting upon to undermine U.S. resource development. And so I think, you know, as Heritage, one of our main goals for next year, in the event that we do have some either repeal of executive orders or the issuing of new orders that we think support this kind of responsible energy program, that we help get those passed into law and then encourage the Congress to enforce the laws, which would be good for all of us. And a little bit of a change of pace, a question I've actually been thinking about a great deal since my visit to Alaska in 2023, and I echo the public service announcement that it's a fantastic place to go. Strongly recommend it for your next vacation. But it has to do with exports of natural gas, in particular from Alaska, and potential security vulnerabilities, because China is a major customer. And I have told our friends in the Gulf, for example, that I am strongly supportive of them selling energy to China all day long at a licit market price. So I don't object to them consuming energy, but they can give them an outsized influence over the exporting entities. So in 2017, Alaska and China signed an agreement that would see China receiving 75% of the natural gas from Alaska's North Slope pipeline. Can you share some updates on this? What is the current status, and how has that engagement with China gone?
So when I came into office, that changed. We haven't had much engagement with China. We've reestablished our engagement with our Korean friends, our Japanese friends, and others. This is very interesting because you're living in very exciting times. I mean, I'm an old guy. I see a lot of young folks here, but I've never experienced anything like this. And what I mean by that is, just 2-3 years ago, we were talking about transitioning energy. Even 6 months ago, transitioning energy. And now the term that most of us are using is additionality. We're not going to have enough energy, period, with the supercomputers, AI, the data farms. They're talking about gigapower. I mean, magnitudes that we can't even fathom. And so we're not going to get there with just renewables. And we're not going to get there, in some respects, even on our current production of oil, which has reached record highs. So where I'm going with that is, in Alaska, we are both having conversations. Senator Sullivan just came back from a trade trip with several senators to Japan and Korea. Senator Sullivan is one of our senators, and Senator Murkowski is the other. But at the same time, we're having conversations with data farms because of the enormous amounts of energy that they need. So we envision very quickly in the near future a situation where we're moving gas down a pipeline, a large pipeline, to Alaska itself with these data farms, and these supercomputing computers, but also exporting to our friends in Asia at the same time. So it's probably going to be a dual approach. We have all the permits for this pipeline. We've jumped over all. We've worked through just about every court case there is. I think there's one minor court case left on this pipeline, but we know exactly how much gas we have. We know exactly what the makeup of the gas is in terms of other gases within it. We know exactly what it would take to ship it to Japan. We've done that for 50 years. We're there, but we have not engaged the Chinese since we came into office. We took a different approach. We took a more private sector approach, and I think it's going to pay dividends here shortly.
No, that's very good news, because it seemed to me a pretty clear plot on their part to gain outsized influence over Alaska by being such a dominant consumer. And Diana, as we go into these potential legislative solutions, as we have to be cognizant in a think tank, it is far easier to propose policy solutions than actually implement them. So President Roberts has encouraged us to be a do tank rather than a think tank. So along those lines, can you talk about maybe the top 3 proposals in your paper that you think could make the easiest legislative progress? The ones, as you said, this is such a common sense thing. We might even get bipartisan support for.
Well, there are, yeah. So quite a lot of what President Biden has done has been outside the legislature. So to change this, the president, a new president, whether it's President Harris or President Trump, can just do it right away. So the requirements for electric vehicles, the requirements to close down the power plants, I mean, it's tremendously dangerous to have our power plants closed down in 2035 or 2040 because there is no technology to sequester 95% of their emissions, which is what they have to do in order to keep the power plant open. A country can very easily become a failed state if it doesn't produce enough energy. You can look at South Africa, you can look at Venezuela, used to be thriving economies, and now basically having major problems of electricity production. So a lot of these do not even take any legislation through Congress. But one thing I wanted to say that's bipartisan is banning these Chinese electric vehicles. And there was a Commerce Department proposed rule put out this week that would go part of the way to do that. Because if Americans are concerned about a spy balloon going overhead, they should be really concerned about these electric vehicles going around America's streets, close to power plants, close to military bases, and sending back information to the Chinese Communist Party. So maybe some of you don't realize it because the US government does not right now own a stake in Ford, GM, and Stellantis, although they might have to do that after they go bankrupt with the mandate for electric vehicles. But the Chinese Communist Party owns a major stake in practically every major Chinese company, including BYD, Build Your Dreams, the major vehicle exporter. And these cars can collect information, send it back to China. They can also be stopped from remote. If you have a GM car and you subscribe to OnStar, GM says it can stop it from remote if it's disabled. Imagine if the Chinese Communist Party, because we had some involvement in some China-Taiwan difficulties, decided they were going to stop all the electric vehicles in the United States via remote. Or even worse, spoof with their navigation systems, spoof with their braking systems and make them not work. This is a major national security threat to us. Plus, as all of you know, to buy a car in the United States, you often get an auto loan. So you buy one of these Chinese EVs, say the BYD Seagull, which is going to go on sale in 2025 for $11,500 in Germany. Even with a 100% tariff, that's $23,000. So you buy one of those, you get an auto loan. You have to give your credit card information, your social security information, your mortgage, your banking information, all this information about you to BYD then of course it goes straight to the Chinese Communist Party. Well, I think all of us realize that this is a major threat. We see these electric vehicles infiltrating Europe, putting auto workers there out of business. Already Stellantis has laid off 2,500 people just last month. Ford, GM are laying off auto workers. Think of all the mechanics who repair your cars. They would lose their jobs too. The auto parts suppliers. So America needs to have control over its transportation system. We have plenty of oil to make the gasoline, and I think it's a bipartisan effort to be able to end this mandate that Americans have to drive EVs.
Well, thank you. Well, we just have a few minutes left, and so, Governor, I'd like you to take a few minutes and just any closing thoughts you have, things we haven't asked that you think we need to know, what messages you're delivering here in Washington from Alaska.
So America became the greatest country in the history of the world because of our resources, because of our technology, and because of our policies. When you compare two countries, for example, very briefly, when you look at Iceland, Iceland doesn't have oil. They don't have gold. When the Vikings first went there, they wrecked the forest. It's one of the most environmentally degraded countries in Europe. People don't understand that. They don't have a lot of resources. But what the Icelanders have is a pretty good policy. So they put together whatever they have there and they put it to good use. You look at Venezuela, more resources than just about any place on the planet. They did it to themselves. And that should be a lesson for America. We're not running out of oil. We're not really running out of ideas. We're getting these mandates. Some of the people here talking today, some of you here will be shamed by friends or associates or others outside the building for even questioning where we're going with this country. That's problematic. That's un-American. But I really think we have the ability to turn this around. We've talked about the election coming up. I don't think it's a secret who I'm going to be voting for. And there's a reason for that. Because that individual believes in what got America here today. The other individual believes, along with the groups that support that individual, everything that's wrong with America. And where they're going to take us, we have no idea. But from what we've seen so far, it's not going to be great. And so I would just leave you all with the thought that the solutions to our problems are here in America because the problems we're creating are being created by ourselves here in America. The world looks to us for leadership. And right now, the world is really scratching its head as to where this country is going to go. And so, in the end, I'm very bullish on this country if we have the right policies in place and the right people putting those policies in place. The resources are there. The technology is there. The know-how is there. The question is, are we going to jettison this social engineering we've had across the entire society, and not just economically, or are we going to continue with some consider madness? And so, again, you got to vote on November 5th. All of us do.
Well, thank you. Diana?
No, I just want to echo what the governor says, and we need to focus on energy resilience, on energy security. We have the ability to do that right here in this country. It's not fair trade when we import goods from a country that subsidizes all its products, subsidizes labor, subsidizes energy, subsidizes capital. This is not free trade. There are national security implications, and we need to take care of ourselves, and we have the ability to do that.
We can, and one of the things that's really become very clear for me over the course of this year of working on Chinese handcuffs is the just vast advantages of the United States. I think we're the only country that could independently feed, defend, and fuel ourselves without imports. It wouldn't be fun, it would be expensive and painful, but we could do it. And so that is just a huge, huge advantage. And the other thing we haven't discussed much here today, but is very important to us here at Heritage, because after all, conservation has conservative in it, as Dr. Roberts likes to say, is that we can do this in the cleanest, least intrusive way. That the extraordinary reduction in emissions under President Trump happened largely because of the conversion to natural gas, but there's no reason we can't continue that process. We have been very responsibly bringing down our emissions while China's emissions have exploded. And they may say nice things at the United Nations General Assembly this week, and I am profoundly glad I am not there this year. But they may say nice things, but they're doing the opposite. They are the problem with the climate. They are not the solution. And I think the United States can really continue to lead on that. So Diana, Governor, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.